Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is an Artorias open source intelligent app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and stay informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we're joined again by our good friend and regular speaker and guest on this Bluff episodes, John. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on here, man. So we're on here to talk about the Houthis. It's supposed to be Yemen, Houthis, Iran, everything, the United States, everything that's been going on. It's been a wide-ranging list of developments here just in the past week, some even in the past day or as we speak now, right? So we'll be talking about that. Always glad to be on here. Thanks for having me.
And I think you're a perfect guest also to speak about this. I mean, last week we kind of had that major breaking news space with India and Pakistan, just for our listeners for following up. I mean, it's kind of interesting. We recorded that episode before the Connecticut outage happened. We kind of went through a wide range of potential outcomes, and it looked like it was kind of a more serious tit for tat military operations, obviously much more expansive than kind of what the Indian response was, not limited to Kashmir, but it was much more expansive than that. But it does look like the United States did do a significant amount of diplomatic pressure to achieve a ceasefire. So that's something we're definitely going to have an eye on. We did have a lot of emergency Twitter spaces, X spaces to kind of cover over that. And so now the situation does look like, for the most part, the ceasefire is in place, and the worst at least looks like it's behind us. But as you alluded to, we really wanted to do an episode on kind of this U.S. Houthi campaign. Right when Bluff, one of the first episodes we did last year, actually touched upon this. Obviously, that was during the Biden administration and talking about kind of the strike campaigns that the Biden administration authorized against the Houthis, which were, much more targeted, focusing more on capabilities. And that, even President Biden famously said, are we going to continue striking the Houthis? Yes. Is it going to stop the Houthis from conducting strikes on the Red Sea? No. I mean, I think this was just a form of retaliation, but an understanding that it was pretty difficult for the U.S. to kind of really degrade the Houthis' military capabilities. And, since Trump came into office, that mindset has completely changed. And we have seen a significant increase of strikes on the Houthis. I mean, President Trump did announce that there was a ceasefire achieved with the Houthis, mediated by Oman. And then recently we saw the Houthis launch a ballistic missile against Israel's main airport, Ben Gurion. And so, as anything, it's always kind of tense, difficult to track, and the situation can change in a heartbeat. But John, I'd like to give you this opportunity because I know this is something you focus on a lot. Give us an overview of kind of the Trump administration's strike campaign against the Houthis in Yemen. I think our listeners probably don't understand how significant and how intense it was, especially compared to the Biden administration.
Yeah, so Operation Rough Rider is the name of the operation conducted by the Trump administration. It's really just the continuation of what we all kind of know as Operation Poseidon Archer, which was the Biden administration's campaign to strike Houthi targets. The remit is really the same, right? To degrade and destroy the Houthis' capabilities, ability to strike and commercial and naval shipping in the Red Sea, and right hamper that key trade route there. But the key difference here, though, is that it was characterized by a significant uptick in the targeting and just the tempo of these strikes here. I think we heard Pete Hegseth say over and over and over again that this will be unrelenting, and it really kind of was, right? I think one thing that was, at least for me, right, I will agree when I feel, will admit when I've been wrong in the past, right? I was somebody who was saying, just keep bombing them harder, for lack of a better term. This is what we need to do to kind of realize results. But one thing I forgot to caveat myself when I said it, right, was that it depends what you target, right? And so just bombing, things that we see out in the open, which is kind of what the Biden administration was doing, more reciprocal strikes. I mean, not reciprocal, more retaliatory strikes that were in direct retaliation for the strikes on shipping. So right, the Houthis would launch a missile. We'd launch that. I think you mentioned this as well in a space before. We'd strike the specific launcher that launched that missile, or the specific berthing that send out that not UAV, these unmanned UGVs, that is, not UGVs, sorry. Um, but the the thing for me though is it's characterized by over 1,000 Houthi, not characterized, over 1,000 Houthi targets have been hit by the U.S. and the U.K. as well. I think the U.K. took part in a number of strikes, waves of strikes, but not all of them. Obviously, they provide some other support behind the scenes, more logistical and other things like that as well. Obviously, there's the distance factor between RAF typhoons that are based in Cyprus striking, so this logistically it makes more sense for them to provide other means of support. But yeah, over 1,000 Houthi targets were hit since the beginning of Operation Rough Rider, which was started in January, pretty soon after the Houthis began. Started in March. Sorry, I'm getting my mind mixed up here. Right, so ORR, which I'll call Operation Rough Rider from here on out, um, targeted a number of Houthi decision makers as well. I think, as we understand it, as of right now, about two high-level Houthi decision makers were taken out in the strikes. It remains to be seen if we try to target more and weren't able to kill these guys or eliminate them. But so far, I believe one UAV commander and then a high-level intelligence commander in Ansar Allah were taken out. Um, we also targeted staging areas and UAV production and storage sites as well. And then I think the most kind of notable one was the targeting of the Houthi port infrastructure at Ras Issa and the fuel ports there. Uh, since then, the Israelis have also began targeting the Houthis as well, but not support. I mean, their operations are likely subordinate to whatever their own operational titles are. But the U.S. Has helped them and aided them in some direct strikes as well, but then also aided them logistically. Obviously, the providing key air refuelers and other things like that. The Israelis don't necessarily have the ability to conduct strikes at scale like this, given their limited tanker fleet. That's kind of like a wide overview of Operation Rough Rider and kind of what the Trump administration approach to this has been, right? But it's also been, kind of giving the Israelis more leeway has kind of been something I think that we could all agree on has been something they've done across the board here. This doesn't only pertain to Yemen, other areas as well. With their dealings with Iran, then I think most notably would be obviously the situation in the Gaza Strip right now, um, and kind of the ongoing operations that are now in the up tempo of the operations there. So this is kind of a wide overview of kind of the Trump administration's approach to this. Now, since then, in the past week and a half, now we've seen this quote unquote ceasefire. It still remains to be seen how tenable this is, but the ceasefire the story goes, right? And so we're seeing a lot of different conflicting reports here, people taking credit and such and such. But the Iranians reportedly pressured the Houthis to de-escalate, specifically on striking commercial naval shipping in the Red Sea, and more specifically U.S. ships as well, right? To essentially gain like brownie points with the U.S. to, and kind of induce them to come back to the table here. So far, it seems like that may be happening here. I don't, it still also remains to be seen here. Don't want to say that too many times, but they we're now seeing kind of a softening, not softening of relations, but kind of the USB and the Trump administration, has been more willing to kind of acquiesce to some of Iran's, not the, their points of contention between us and them on the nuclear deal. And so essentially, Iran reportedly pressured the Houthis to kind of come to the table by, with, and through Oman as well, who's been a key mediator between the world and the Houthis, right? Because they're not the internationally recognized government in Yemen. So they use Oman as well to kind of be the executors of some of their foreign policy sometimes. And so the Omanis got in contact with the United States. It's my understanding they got in contact directly with the Trump administration. I would love to hear you guys' takes on whether or not you think, we were talking about this before, whether or not the State Department was even involved in this one at all. Here, it seems like, they got direct in contact with the Trump administration, not necessarily through normal means, so that they could kind of quickly do this. And it was kind of a surprise deal here. I remember waking up to it, being like, what's going on? And so the U.S. also announced that we would stop strikes on the Houthis as well as a result of this ceasefire. Right. We've also been kind of reticent to clarify whether or not this pertains to Israel. I think it's pretty clear now that it doesn't now, given events in the past couple of days here. And so we've seen the Houthis continue to target Israel because I don't believe that this was part of that. And we've also seen a kind of a distancing, uh, kind of more space between the Trump and the Bibi administration, sorry, the Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump here in the past couple of weeks, based off of just the growing kind of point of contention here has kind of been de-escalation across the board, and well, we've kind of seen Israel's actions in Gaza and elsewhere. Um, and I think the Trump administration kind of made the decision that, hey, us tethering ourselves to Israel completely has kind of put us a lot of these deals in jeopardy here, and so we're kind of moving forward, right? The pretty wishy-washy waters here. So, but yeah, that's a good, I think, overall overview of everything. Um, Obviously, the shipping has not yet returned to the Red Sea as well. I, I think most of the prime risk assessment firms, ships are still cautioning a return there, right? So that the routes that they kind of imposed to mitigate the threat to shipping, those are still in effect. Ships are still skirting it as well, and so we're not going to see the immediate effects of this ceasefire for a while, I think. Sorry, let me word that again. The immediate effects of the ceasefire aren't, this economic relief that people think is going to come flooding in because these routes haven't changed, and the ships are still there as well, and also the U.S. Navy is there as well still, as well as European vessels, the naval vessels from EU naval forces in Operation Aspidas, and which is now merged with Operation Atalanta as well. So that's a broad overview and long-winded one. Sorry for that.
So I think there are two things here. One is we have heard previously where the Houthis, reach out and they launch missiles trying to hit some of these shipping lanes, and then they will claim that those ships were either owned by Israel or destined for Israel. And there are multiple instances where that was not true. So I don't think that we can just write them off and say that they're going to stop doing that. The other thing is, and I wouldn't call Israel a proxy, but it does seem like one of those things where the United States comes up with this or agrees to a ceasefire, but the Houthis then come out and say that they will continue reaching out and trying to strike Israel wherever they can, which I think is going to be a problem for the shipping. And it wouldn't surprise me if they continue to try and attack Israel in whatever way they can. That means that Israel has taken this as a green light and probably has had conversations with security officials within the United States about the actions that they're going to take. So I believe that Israel is a way that the United States can still have an understanding of the situation on the ground, and we can still see, and we will still see Israel reaching out and trying to hit Yemen wherever they can. And for the second time in a week or maybe 2 weeks, the IDF is now issuing a warning to at least 3 different ports saying that they need to be evacuated immediately, including Hudaytha and Salif and Ras Isra. So the last time we heard that was for the international airport in Sana'a prior to Israeli strikes. So I imagine, this came out just a few hours ago. I imagine that we're going to see some action from the Israelis against those ports, and I find it hard to believe, or at least I would hope, that there is some sort of communication between the United States and Israel. And if that communication isn't happening, that in and of itself is maybe a problem. Do you think you could expand on that? Or Stefano, go
Yeah,
ahead.
and if I may, I guess that's the thing, right? The question then become like if this announcement, because these are pretty wide range targets, and we'll probably get more detail at the end of this recording. And actually, if it breaks during, we'll make sure to share it here and try to provide some quick analysis. But it does indicate that this Israeli action. I mean, it's a direct. I think it's a continuation of the response for the Ben Gurion attack, where the Israelis are probably trying to hit harder than they were hit. And I think this is Israel saying we're not just going to do a tit for tat. We're going to continue to impose further costs on Houthi action. But I mean, it does raise the concern that the Houthis then might view this as the carte blanche to start retargeting a lot of U.S. naval vessels, merchant ships, because the Houthi attack campaign against Israel continues. And so, is there a possibility that Houthis might view this as any ceasefire negotiation reached with the United States via Oman is effectively dead on the water, and military hostilities resume?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of you there. I think, earlier when I mentioned that the long-term tenability of this ceasefire is really in question here, just for that reason, right? Because the Houthis have tethered their actions historically, in the past couple of years since the Israel-Hamas war started, right? They have tethered their actions and their targeting of shipping and in the Red Sea originally to the war in Gaza, right? And so and it'll be very, very, very easy for them, whether or not the U.S. is involved in strikes at all, to say, hey, the United States is, kind of similar to when Hezbollah was saying that they're going to target Cyprus if Great Britain continues to help the United States or provide support for the United States in strikes elsewhere in Syria and things like this, or that they were making claims that the UK was helping Israel bomb them and things like that, right? Or conducting strikes, right? Obviously, this was false, right? But it's very easy to draw the line there. Actually, honestly, even easier than Hezbollah. Even an easier time than Hezbollah had doing this, right? Because the U.S. has already provided support for strikes as recently as the past few weeks here, right? And so I don't see that this lasting long, specifically for that reason, right? The Houthis have tethered their actions to the war, the conflict in Israel, and I really don't see, right? For instance, I mentioned shipping before is a good example. I don't see like shipping returning to the Red Sea until kind of the Houthis stop targeting everyone, kind of like Matthew mentioned as well before. Um, uh, and so I think until the war in Gaza stops, we're not going to see an actual meaningful ceasefire or even a total, cease to all the hostilities indefinitely for, I don't think that's in the near future.
Actually,
Barring a
John, if
major
I can, if
shift
I
in
can jump in
Israeli.
here, because
Sorry.
I do want to ask a question. Sorry for jumping, because I think this is an important question, though. I mean, at some point, though, the question needs to be asked, right? I think it's pretty hard to argue that the Houthis haven't suffered a degradation of combat power, right? I mean, if you kind of look at historically when this first kind of campaign started, and now where we're at this moment, it does look like, outside of even the ceasefire, that has their capabilities been destroyed from a military perspective? No, because they still have some capabilities. But I think it's pretty obvious that yes, there was a degradation. So at some point, when does it even become untenable for the Houthis, though, to continue these campaign strikes and continue to get targeted? Because if you look at the Trump administrations and how expansive their targeting campaign and what Israel is also targeting, it goes at the heart of the matter, not only of the Houthis' deep strike capabilities, but other just more basic military and even government structures. We started them targeting, as you said, fuel depots, key ports, the airport, key for humanitarian aid to arrive. We're seeing targets against key Houthi commanders and officials. I think it's important to highlight that the amount of civilian casualties reported to have died because of U.S. strike ever since the Trump administration expanded the strikes. I mean, the amount of civilian casualties killed in Yemen has significantly raised and increased. But that kind of also goes to the point where the Trump administration is targeting key commanders of the Houthi military organization and the terrorist organization, right? So, wouldn't you believe, though, that the Houthis' capabilities have been degraded, and there might be an issue where the sustainability of this strike campaign is just untenable for the Houthis long term?
Yeah, I think when I was talking about the nature of the targets earlier, right, I kind of alluded to this as well, right? Um, I think one thing we can all agree on is Trump likes to get things done very fast, right? And I think this campaign was not one of the things this was not going to get that done fast. Now, one way was to do that was to, change the nature of your targets, or to change the targets that you're, you know, uh, more important targets, right? Critical infrastructure, essentially, right? We're now seeing those We've now seen strikes target that in the past half a month, right? Specifically, whereas before they were going for, right, like you mentioned before, military commanders, bases in the mountains, like specifically Mount Nukem, I believe, as well, the facilities under there and other underground facilities, right? And now we're seeing them target this critical infrastructure, right? And then within a week, whether or not Iran had anything to do with pushing the Houthis to do this, the Houthis were suffering, right? And so the interesting thing about the release when we first began targeting the fuel ports from the Department of Defense. They identified, right, that these fuel ports and just the import of fuel by the Houthis was a key center of gravity for them on maintaining power, right? And so they began to strike these because they understand, right, if they can't provide fuel to their people, to whether it's heating their homes, driving their cars, right, whatever else it may be, right. And they also use it to kind of keep that hold on the people as well. If they can't provide that, then obviously things become untenable for the Houthis themselves of just maintaining power, right? And it's interesting that the DoD release did kind of note that as their center of gravity. They didn't exactly use the exact term center of gravity, but in so many words they did say that. And so we're seeing them continue to strike ports like this as well. And now I think it's become untenable for the Houthis. I think prior, I think their losses were still with for what they would call what we call acceptable losses and stuff like that. Even after Operation Rough Rider started, I don't think we were they were treating them to the point where they were like, oh, we have to come to the table. Whereas if we continue to strike critical infrastructure at this tempo, should the kind of hostilities between the U.S. and us and the Houthis resume, I don't see them being able to last very long here because this critical infrastructure is a key center of gravity for the Houthis, and maintaining it is as well, right? Obviously, this would have to happen in concert with another of other actions to really hurt their center of gravity, but I don't think that in a short answer there would be no. I don't think that they'd be able to withstand this very long. Now, if we begin to just see strikes again, like if we continue to see strikes that really only target some of their military facilities, they're really not that effective and things like that. I think that they can do it indefinitely, right? They've shown that they are pretty resilient. I mean, we saw them withstand a pretty extensive Saudi bombing campaign a number of times, right? They've done this before, right? But once you begin targeting that critical infrastructure, there's only so long that you can withstand an inundation of strikes on your critical infrastructure. Um, uh, yeah.
So can I ask you then a follow up to that? I mean, from your observation, your reporting, I think we're seeing a degradation. But I think my question for you, because I think the consensus we have really the Houthi hold on power is probably pretty solid at this point, even if they lose their deep strike capabilities and some key military infrastructure, even these critical, center of gravities and civilian infrastructures, right? But for now, what we're seeing is that the Houthis still maintain a very solid power of control, and we're not seeing necessarily the Republic of the Yemeni government really trying to challenge Houthi territorial control and a reignition of the civil war, active conflict along the front lines. We're not really seeing that, correct?
Yeah, and though there could be some other reasons behind that, though, right? So there is kind of some intragovernmental contention that's kind of ongoing when we're talking about the internationally recognized Yemeni government. That's ongoing. They've had some problems, with their parliament, members resigning, members who have kind of had these scandals and things like that as of like pretty recently, actually, in the past couple of weeks. We've had key leaders step down and other ones step up in these positions. So I just don't actually even see there being political will and focus right now on doing something like that right now. I also would be interested to know, maybe we'll find this out down the line, whether or not the U.S. did float the kind of the idea of a renewed offensive against the Houthis to them, and whether or not they're willing to acquiesce, or whether they could even acquiesce due to the current situation, kind of politically and then just internally as well. But yes, I think there are some other factors that kind of is why we didn't see them disengage. I think it wasn't just them saying we don't want to do this, right? It was more so we're not in the position we feel like we need to be to do this.
So, with that being said, then, John, the question then would return to is, and we've talked about this in multiple episodes, is how deeply embedded and critical would Iranian military support be for the Houthis? I mean, we talked about this in one of our previous episodes, which was, at some point it became pretty clear that the Iranians basically did a train the trainer model, and that they enabled the Houthis to kind of produce these capabilities domestically. Because if you even looked all the way back at the Biden administration, what they were targeting and mentioning that CENTCOM press statements were targeting were like weapons manufacturing and ballistic missiles manufacturing capabilities, indicating that these capabilities now are in-house in Yemen and not reliant on let's say, just exports from Iran. The question is, if the Houthis would want to restart and expand these deep strike capabilities, do we see Iran play a critical role in doing that, or do you believe that the Houthis have enough in-house knowledge that they were going to that they're able to do this on their own without Iranian direct support.
Yeah, I think you do raise a good point here. I mean, I think recently as last year, right? We saw interdiction of, anti-ship cruise missiles, Iranian anti-ship cruise missiles, and other engine parts as well, right? So I think Iran still does provide this support for their kind of industry there. But yeah, you're right. They do kind of have this in-house ability to produce these kind of long-range fires here that they've used to kind of execute their strategic outlook or foreign policy, whatever you want to call it. When you're talking about the Houthis. But I do see it. I think it really all has more to do with. I mean, based off well, strictly Iran's response, right? I think will have more to will be kind of tethered to however this nuclear deal goes with the United States, if it does go at all, right? I think they'll be reticent to continue to support the Houthis at that level if they come to some type of understanding with the United States. I also would assume, right, that as a part of negotiations, on the nuclear program specifically, that is, they the U.S. is going to the Houthis are going to be one of the points that we're going to bring up and say, hey, you need to limit your support for the Houthis. We've said it openly. Pete Hegseth has practically screamed it on Twitter. I mean, on X, that is, right? And so, this is definitely a point that's part of the negotiations. And so, if they do go well for Iran, and I think Iran, some days I think they want it to go on, other days I think they're trying to torpedo it. But I think Iran overall does kind of want these deal to go well, right? Obviously, they would benefit from reduced sanctions as well, even though they skirt them pretty well already. But reduced sanctions would help their economy out. It kind of helps the domestic situation out a lot. And so, if they do go well, and I think Iran does want them to go well, I think that they would limit their direct support to the Houthis here. Now, I think they're always going to provide tacit support for the Houthis and other groups around, and obviously they maintain that plausible deniability at times, right? That's kind of a key Houthi, regional strategy that they employ. I mean, not Houthi, key Iranian regional strategy that they employ, right? We've seen it with Hezbollah, we've seen it with Hamas, we've seen it with groups in Iraq, we've seen it with, and then we've seen it with the Houthis. So, yeah, I do think it really does matter. It really does depend on how the deal goes and if there is a deal at all. Now, if the deal flops again or flops more indefinitely, we could see them up support for the Houthis and increase more direct support for the Houthis. I think we kind of seen that at times. We saw that last year doing kind of doing when we were kind of in the heat of the Houthi strike campaign against shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. And I think that may have lessened. And I think maybe one of the preconditions for the U.S. to even come to the table will likely be a reduced support for the Houthis from Iran.
So I think there are a few things there. First of all, it's kind of like a semi-deniability. I'm not even sure I would qualify that as probable. And we're talking about the nuclear deal. I think that's a very important aspect to look at because that is probably one of the most important things when it comes to any change in position with the Iranians' support for the Houthis. But at the same time, I think they understand that Trump is very unpredictable. And when we look at the withdrawal from the JCPOA, any deal that they make, there's going to be a level of hesitancy because, 4 years from now, or who knows, like 2 years from now, even when we're still under Trump, he could change his mind. And we've already seen that with trade deals. So it creates an actual uncertainty there. And so it wouldn't surprise me if they are making these contingency plans to increase their support. The other thing that I think is very important to keep in mind, and we were just talking about that, is if Israel continues to strike at the Houthis, independent of what the United States has decided or agreed to, that's still going to cause a lot of issues. And if you remember, like when Hussein al-Houthi was killed, they just in 2004, they just turned him into a martyr, and that was long before they like fully took control of Sana'a. So all of that I think is very important to keep in mind, and I'm not sure that we could dislodge the Houthis through air alone. Obviously, the United States has been much more successful at this than Saudi Arabia was. But I'm not sure how you actually dislodge them from Sana'a because they have created this foundation that even predates the Houthis or even Ansarullah, that goes all the way back to the youth movement that they had built in the 90s. So how do you how would you see tackling that, especially when we look at, the quote unquote scream, which is the motto of the Houthis, which is Allah is great, death to America, death to Israel, a curse upon the Jews, victory of Islam. And please do not cut that audio. But that ties Israel directly to the United States. And so if Israel continues this campaign, is that also not detrimental to the goals of the United States if the goals indeed are separate from the goals of Israel?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with you there. I do think it is going to cause a problem. I think it already is causing a problem here. We've seen Israel actions kind of throw a wrench in kind of in the gears here a couple of times now. Um, but the point you brought up here, right, is one interesting thing I do think, and I personally think it may be a misconception for some people. Um, Not necessarily you, but more so, we kind of see people kind of talk about Houthi regime change a lot or regime change in Sana'a a lot. I don't think that's what the Trump administration was trying to do. Right. Remember the remit of, and nor do I think the Biden administration was doing it as well. I think it's important to remember that the remit of Operation Warfighter Fighter and the prior operation, its parent operation for that matter, Operation Poseidon Archer, was really just to degrade their abilities um, to conduct strikes against shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, right? And so I think if the Trump administration can achieve that goal, there through whatever means, whether it's bombing the Houthis or sitting on at a table with them, I think the Trump administration is going to take that route. Remember, because they still do scream no new wars, regardless of the current situation, right? Over and over and over again, and ultimately, it would look better for Trump to make a deal with the Houthis and to kind of bomb them into some type of submission or out of power, or to support either directly or indirectly some type of Yemeni government offensive, a renewed Yemeni government offensive against them. I just don't think that was even the goal here. Now, how would that happen? If you want to talk about regime change, yeah, I do agree. It would have something on the ground would have to um, take place. You're not going to bomb them into submission. I do agree with you there. The Saudis kind of learned that the hard way, right? And they, those were in tandem with ground movement as well. Um, but I just don't think that that was ever the goal of the Trump or the Biden administration here. And honestly, I would say that I don't think it should be the goal. I think we were saying before, right, that whether or not people will admit it, or the international community will admit it, the Houthis are really a state actor. Is kind of how I view them, right? They hold the seat of power in Sana'a. And just like you both have said before, they're heavily, heavily, heavily entrenched, not just in Sana'a, but in other Houthi controlled areas, right? And so I don't see just, I mean, I think U.S. military and civilian decision makers have nightmares about what a war, a U.S. war against the Houthis would look like. I mean, it would look, eerily similar to what we have had in the past 20 some odd years in Afghanistan and Iraq, kind of these never ending wars. I mean, the Saudis learned it, firsthand. And we, obviously we were sitting right there next to them watching this happen. Um, and I just don't see that it would be a smart idea to even try and dislodge them. Now, that the caveat here is if the internationally recognized government in Yemen gets their stuff together, right, for lack of a better term, because there's a lot of internal stuff going on, like I mentioned before. I maybe possibly that they could conduct another operation to try and dislodge the Houthis, but the Houthis also have a very, very massive, massive, kind of military force, right? That they really haven't really used for a while. They haven't been getting attrited either for a while. These strikes have attrited them some, but largely, the death toll while it's rising now has really not affected them that much. I mean, they still maintain this massive body of troops that they can use pretty effectively. And when dug in, we saw them very effective before. And so I just don't think that we're going to see anything like that from the Yemeni international government in Yemen anytime soon here. And then at the same time, I just don't think it would be smart of the Trump administration to try and conduct an operation or to provide support for an operation to dislodge the Houthis because, as you mentioned, Matt, right? I think it just they scream death to America, death to Israel, right? And they're just like, look, the Israelis and the Americans are attacking us. They're fomenting these attacks against us, right? And then, we could just see a resurgence of kind of the quote unquote axis of resistance across the Middle East. And I think Iran would also significantly increase not only aid to the Houthis, but also to some of these other insurgent groups and non-state actors throughout the region to kind of foment violence against U.S. and Israeli, whether it be citizens or military or civilian infrastructure across the region. So, I think that that would be a nightmare, I think, to try and do that. And I think it would be very hard. And it would have to be, obviously, like you mentioned, in tandem with some type of ground operation.
And I think it's important to remember that the Houthi movement, obviously, it predates this, but when it really started gaining traction, especially in Sana'a and the surrounding areas, and there's still some questions as to whether or not it's technically Shia. Don't think we want to get into that. None of us are Islamic scholars, but it began with like the Believing Youth movement, and it wasn't until the invasion of Iraq that they started taking up what they call the scream, which is that praise Allah, death to America, death to Israel, as I mentioned before, and that was born out of the invasion of Iraq, and so I really do worry what it would take to actually dislodge them would be almost a step too far. And it's not just consequences within Yemen, but they would be broader reaching, I think. And at the same time, it's also worth noting that it wouldn't actually be a regime change because Yemen failed to actually unify. Um, I'm not really sure exactly where you go from here because there's this kind of history where they would uh, they would strike, they would force a ceasefire, and in 2008, I believe they were the ones that actually offered the Yemeni government a ceasefire, and they took it. So they wait till they're strong, and it's a smarter operation than I think we're used to when dealing with a lot of these organizations. And when they really militarized was when we saw the injection of Salafist groups into Yemen, and that's when they organized to push back. So they control their portion of the country, and I wonder, is there anything that can be done to bring them to the table at this point in a meaningful way, or do we expect them to just retreat, um, gain as much power as they can, and then begin everything all from the beginning? Because unless we deal with their grievances, which are separate from Iran, in some meaningful way, I believe that we are going to continue to see aggression from them. So how do you square that circle? What can the United States do without bringing Israel on board to bring them to the table and create something meaningful? And
And if
obviously, we also need Saudi Arabia there.
and if I can and jump because we it's kind of what you're one of the things you're kind of the broader aspect that you're highlighting. Because we talk about the Yemeni government, the kind of the internationally recognized Yemeni government, which I believe doesn't want to conduct an offensive right now against the Houthi because of kind of the concern that you kind of highlight, Matthew, is like, well, are you doing this because the U.S. is doing it, Israel is doing it, and kind of that public perception. But let's be real, the internationally recognized government in Yemen is probably one of the weakest military factions right now fighting against the Houthis for all intents and purposes. I mean, you have the UAE-backed Southern Transition Council, which are kind of the separatists of southern Yemen. I think for our listeners who might not know the history of Yemen, Yemen did not become a unified country until after the Cold War. It used to be North Yemen and yet South Yemen. And so you still have a very significant separatist movement in southern Yemen that is backed by the United Arab Emirates, that have been a key backer of this movement, that have been still very vocal in their desires to, again, gain independence for southern Yemen. You also have, for example, other major parties. Just one major one is, for example, the Al Islah Party, kind of the offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen, that has also been very active there and even targeted by some of these GCC countries who view the Muslim Brotherhood as a significant threat, specifically the UAE. and the Al Party has also been fighting against the Houthis. You touched upon, Matthew, kind of the presence of extremist groups such as Al Qaeda and ISIS that have a significant presence in Yemen, and this isn't even broadly touching about the tribal conflicts that exist even internally within the country, and I think that's kind of the problem. And so, John, for your point, I mean, it's really, you can even make an argument that Saleh, the reason why he tried to stay in power was because he was kind of the only one through his General People's Congress, the GPC, that through authoritarian rule managed to hold the country together. And now Yemen is basically fractured into various different groups. I mean, the Houthis in their area of control are obviously the predominant, stronger military force that really reigns with brutality and submission of the tribal populations in northern Yemen and in Sana'a, right? I mean, and the Houthis have been very effective at who used to view Saleh as their major enemy, allied with them during the Arab Spring, and then killed them and then subdued the GPC, right? But the Houthis basically rule with brute force. But what I think the general issue we're running into is there even a possibility of seeing a holistic government in Yemen, and that is not just fractured in these various civil wars? In other words, is Yemen the new Somalia, that there's just basically been decades and decades now of what we expect of just civil conflict, war, and the Houthis just leveraging any international crisis to make the name out of themselves, such as Israel Gaza, to target Israel? I just don't see Yemen. The international community is not going to do, I think, what is necessary or desired to bring everybody in the table and force kind of a unified country. I think we're just looking at another Somalia, and it's just now in the Horn of Africa again. Well, not in the Horn of Africa, but in the Red Sea.
Yeah, I mean, you make a good point there, and I think that's a good observation about that. I think barring a significant concession from the international community, right? It's kind of the key nations, the United States, E3, et cetera, and other, even China, maybe, right? But barring a significant concession from us, I don't see, the Houthis being willing to come to the table, in a meaningful way for, to come to any long-term agreement here. When you talk about, so, could we see it just continue to devolve into kind of more like Somalia? I don't really know here, because I think we've seen China also willing to provide support for the Houthis as well, right? And so, the more nations that continue to kind of decide to say, you know what, well, we got to sit at the table with them because they're not going anywhere, right? The more they become legitimized, right? And so as they become more legitimized, right, it's going to deepen their kind of roots there. And at some point, some of these other factions are going to have to come to the table, and essentially acquiesce to the Houthis' demands as the Houthis continue to gain more power. And they'll do that as they get more legitimized. We've already seen this, right? And like you said, hijacking kind of ongoing conflicts in the region and around the world to kind of put the spotlight on them and to kind of increase kind of international involvement, whether that's from Iran, or China or other actors, Russia even, right? We They'll continue to do that, until until they have a major incentive to do otherwise. And so yeah, I just don't see that the Houthis are ever going to go anywhere. And I think the only way that you're going to kind of get this unification of Yemen is with kind of these other factions essentially capitulating, for lack of a better term.
And I wonder if the unification of Yemen should be the goal, because do those borders actually work? And I know the last time we spoke about Yemen, I was always bringing up Al Mukalla, but there's a very different makeup across the country. And if you start looking towards the east and the southeast, I don't know how you bring that to bear. It seems like a recipe for continued conflict.
Yeah, I think the ethnic divisions are pretty interesting here. And so, the funny thing about your question is, I think there's other conflicts, right, where, people, maybe if in hindsight we had asked that same question before, like, should we even be trying to unify the whole nation, right? I think things would have gone way better here. And I think that remains so for you. The same case is true for Yemen here, right? Because let's say, they do kind of, these other factions do kind of capitulate to the Houthis, just to gain that kind of reunification of the country. Who's to say that the Houthis, who will at that point have a monopoly on power in the nation, right? Who's to say that the Houthis will not do something down the line that will anger these other factions, and we'll see another split, right? And so is like is this division kind of the best thing that we're going to get out of this, right? And if we and should we cement these borders?
You know, I think one of the things though that we need to acknowledge, and I think that our listeners aren't grasping, and John, you mentioned this kind of in one of your earlier comments, right? And is that the Houthis are a state actor. And I think for all intents and purposes, that is the right way of viewing them. And I think in their military capabilities, it's pretty clear that they have capabilities that have only been reserved to state actors. And I think there's a very interesting case study to be made of how this non-state actor group managed to develop capabilities that rival or even surpass, nation states, right? I think the Houthi ballistic missile program, as recently shown by their strike against Ben Gurion, is a significant military achievement. And then their one-way attack UAVs and the quantity and the mass. I mean, the Houthis have been involved in this campaign not only against the Red Sea but against Israel for years now. And I think that is something that needs to be studied. And it falls within the broader context of its military campaigns against Saudi Arabia and even the UAE during the Yemeni civil war. And I think at some point that's the key issue, right? Is that the Iranians were able to develop a military organization into a state actor with very potent military capability, far superior than even what Hezbollah had, right? Because when we analyze Hezbollah, it was kind of a state within a state. But of all the capabilities that Hezbollah had, which was very robust, but kind of still pretty simplistic. I mean, mostly their rocket capabilities, similar to what we saw. Hamas is much more expansive and much more capable, but still within that realm. What the Houthis have, ballistic missiles with significant range, over 1,000-kilometer range, up to 2,000 even kilometer ranges, right? Able to target various areas of Israel and multiple strikes. And I think the analysis of the Houthis is that the Houthis were able to really develop that capability and leverage it as successful. I mean, how realistic is it? And I think that's something kind of that the Trump administration with their ceasefire announcements kind of made clear is that there's an understanding that the only way to kind of overthrow the Houthis from Yemen would require a significant military presence that the Trump administration, or I don't think any administration, not even the Biden administration, wants to deal with. And they don't want to run into a situation that the Saudis did and having to commit even to the point where U.S. boots on the ground. So I think there's a tacit acknowledgement that for now, the Houthis are the main backers because the main threat for the Houthis' power in northern Yemen and in Sana'a was the GPC. And the Houthis quickly quashed the GPC and killed the former president when they viewed there was a threat coming in. And so the question now really becomes, I don't see any tribal elements in Sana'a in that region really capable of overthrowing the Houthis. And I think any campaign to dislodge them, there's just not the capabilities or the desire internationally to really do it. And I think the Houthis are here to stay for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I agree. I think the political will, as mentioned before, it's just simply not there to kind of get ingrained in another years long war in another Middle Eastern nation here. Um, uh, and so like kind of like I said before, like is the dislodgement of the Houthis, is that what we should be kind of looking for here? And that's why I do think a lot of people were like, well, Donald Trump, the Operation Rough Rider really didn't do what we wanted it to do. Whereas um, it kind of is what we wanted it to. We really only wanted to bring the Houthis to the table and or just get them to stop striking, shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, right? Not dislodge them. And I think that is one thing that people kind of mistook some of these operations for at first. And I think some people may still do it even now, right? When they kind of are critical of Donald Trump for not kind of realizing the goal of dislodging the Houthis, but as I understand it, that was never the goal before. And honestly, as you mentioned, I don't think it should be now. They're just too deeply ingrained inside Yemen, and the current state of their power now it would take considerable amount of force to dislodge them. Yeah.
Well, John, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity for speaking. Before Matthew wraps it up, I don't know if you wanted to say any final comments before we end this episode.
I was just going to say the same exact thing. John, thank you so much for joining us. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front, and we will talk to you soon.
Yeah, guys, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us, John. This has been an absolutely great episode. Always great to speak with you. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front on our Tories podcast, and we will speak to you soon.